The storm had arrived without warning. By the time the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the quiet highway had turned into a frozen battlefield. Thick snow poured down from the dark sky, covering the road, the trees, and everything in sight. The wind roared so loudly that it sounded like a pack of wolves howling across the empty land. Very few vehicles dared to travel that night. Most people had already found shelter, locking their doors and waiting for the storm to pass. But one man continued riding through the chaos. His name was Jack. Jack was a member of the Hells Angels motorcycle club. With his long beard, leather jacket, and heavy boots, he looked like the kind of man people crossed the street to avoid. His motorcycle engine growled loudly as it pushed forward through the deep snow. The bright headlight cut through the storm like a blade of light in the darkness. Jack had been riding for hours. Snow stuck to his beard and jacket, and the freezing wind tried to push him off the road. But he kept riding, gripping the handlebars tightly to Jack. Storms like this were just another challenge. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of him, surrounded by dark forests and frozen fields. The world felt empty, as if he was the last person left alive. Then suddenly, something unusual caught his attention. Far ahead, barely visible through the swirling snow, he saw a shape on the side of the road. Jack slowed down at first. He thought it might be an abandoned vehicle buried under the snow. But as he moved closer, the outline became clearer. It was a small car, and it didn't look empty. Jack frowned as he reduced the speed of his motorcycle. Something about the situation didn't feel right. In weather like this, no one should be stranded outside. Snow continued, falling heavily as Jack carefully pulled his motorcycle to the side of the road. He stared at the car through the storm. For a moment, he thought about ignoring it and continuing his journey. But something inside him told him to stop, and that decision was about to change several lives forever. Jack turned off the throttle and let the motorcycle roll slowly toward the stranded car. The snow beneath his tires crunched loudly as he approached. The wind pushed against him with brutal force, making it difficult to keep balance. When he finally stopped beside the vehicle, he turned off the engine. For a moment, the world became strangely quiet. Only the sound of the storm remained. Jack stepped off his motorcycle and planted his boots firmly in the deep snow. The freezing wind hit his face instantly, making his eyes water. He pulled his jacket tighter around his body and walked slowly toward the car. The vehicle was almost buried. Snow had piled up around the tires, trapping it completely. The windshield was covered in ice. The side mirrors were barely visible under the thick snow. "This car hasn't moved in a while," Jack muttered under his breath. He walked closer to the driver's side window and tried to see inside. At first, he could only see frost and fog covering the glass. But then he noticed movement. Someone was inside. Jack wiped the window, his gloved hand. What he saw made him pause. Inside the car sat a woman in her early 30s. Her face looked pale and exhausted. Her eyes were filled with fear and desperation. She clutched the steering wheel tightly as if hoping the car would somehow start again. In the back seat were two small children, a little girl and a young boy. They were wrapped in thin blankets, but it was clear they were freezing. Their faces were red from the cold, and their small bodies trembled uncontrollably. The heater inside the car had obviously stopped working. Long ago, Jack stood silently for a moment. This was bad, very bad, in weather like this. People could freeze to death in less than an hour. The woman looked up and noticed the large biker standing outside the window. For a second, fear flashed across her face. A huge man in a leather jacket, covered in snow, staring into her car in the middle of a blizzard. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. Jack stood silently outside the frozen car, staring at the terrified faces inside. For a moment, neither side moved. The storm continued raging around them, snow swirling wildly through the air. Inside the vehicle, Sarah's heart pounded. She had been stuck there for almost an hour. Her car engine had died after sliding off the icy road. No matter how many times she tried to restart it, nothing happened. Her phone battery had died earlier in the evening. The nearest town was miles away. She had begun to lose hope. Then suddenly this biker peered out of the storm, but the sight of him made her nervous. Jack looked intimidating, tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and a leather jacket covered in patches. In normal circumstances, Sarah might have avoided someone like him, but tonight was not normal. Jack gently tapped on the frozen window. The sound made the children flinch. The little girl, Emma, held tightly onto her younger brother Noah. Their small bodies were shaking uncontrollably from the cold. The thin blanket around them did little to stop the freezing air that seeped through the car. Jack could see everything clearly now. The windows were frosted from the inside, which meant the heater had stopped working long ago. The children's lips were slightly pale. Their hands trembled as they tried to stay warm. Jack had seen enough storms in his life to know exactly what this meant. If they stayed in that car much longer, things could become very dangerous. He knocked again, this time more gently. Sarah hesitated, then slowly lowered the window just a little. A blast of icy wind rushed inside the car. Jack leaned closer and spoke in a calm but firm voice. "Are you okay?" Sarah shook her head. "My car died, and we can't move." Jack looked at the children again. They were freezing. He knew what he had to do. Jack stepped back slightly as the freezing wind howled between them. Snowflakes clung to his beard and eyebrows. Slowly melting from the warmth of his breath, Sarah could barely hear his voice over the storm. "My name's Jack," he said calmly. She nodded nervously, but didn't respond. Jack glanced around the empty road. The blizzard was getting worse by the minute. Snow was piling higher against the car tires, slowly burying the vehicle deeper. They couldn't stay there. "How long have you been stuck?" Jack asked. "About 40 minutes, Sarah replied quietly. Jack cursed under his breath. 40 minutes in a dead car during a storm? Not like this was already too long, especially with kids inside. He looked toward the back seat again. Emma's small hands were wrapped around her brother's shoulders, trying to keep him warm. Noah's teeth were chattering loudly as he shivered. Jack had seen enough. "Listen carefully," Jack said. "There's a small hunting cabin about 10 minutes from here. I've stayed there before during storms." Sarah looked at him uncertainly. A stranger, a biker, asking them to follow him into the storm, but Jack's voice remained calm. "You and the kids won't survive." "Long in this car," he said honestly. That sentence hung heavy in the air. Sarah looked at her children. Again, they were getting weaker. Slowly, she realized Jack was right. They didn't have a choice. Jack leaned closer to the frozen car window, brushing away the thick layer of snow with his gloved hand so the woman inside could see his face more clearly. The wind howled violently around him, carrying sharp flakes of ice that stung against his skin. Snow had already begun piling up around the tires of the stranded vehicle, slowly burying it deeper into the frozen road. He bent down slightly and spoke through the small opening in the window, making sure his voice was calm and steady. "Come with me." The words were simple, quiet, direct, but they carried a weight that hung in the air between them. Inside the car, Sarah froze for a moment. Her tired eyes studied the man standing outside. The storm blurred everything around him, but one thing was clear. He was a large biker, covered in snow, wearing a heavy leather jacket. In another situation, on another night, she might have locked the doors and driven away from someone who looked like him. Trusting a stranger in the middle of a blizzard felt terrifying, but staying inside the car was even more dangerous. The engine had died almost an hour ago. The heater had stopped working long before that. Every passing minute made the inside of the vehicle colder. The windows had started freezing from the inside, and Sarah could feel the temperature dropping rapidly. Outside, the wind suddenly howled even louder, shaking the entire vehicle. Snow slammed against the windows as if the storm itself was trying to break in. Then a small voice spoke from the back seat. "Mom." Sarah turned quickly. Emma's small face looked pale. Her lips trembled as she tried to pull the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I'm really cold." Beside her, little Noah was shivering so badly his teeth were chattering. That was the moment Sarah realized they couldn't stay there any longer. Fear was no longer the biggest danger. The cold was. She slowly looked back at Jack standing outside the window. For a brief second, their eyes met through the falling snow. Then Sarah nodded. Jack immediately stepped back and carefully pulled open the car door. The moment it opened, a blast of freezing wind rushed inside, swirling snow across the seats and floor. But Jack moved quickly. He reached into the back seat and gently helped Emma out first, lifting her carefully onto the snowy ground. Then he picked up Noah, wrapping the boy inside his own thick biker jacket to shield him from the brutal wind. The jacket was far too big for the child, but it was warm. Jack crouched slightly so the boy could hold on to him. "Stay close to me," he said firmly. Sarah stepped out next, pulling her coat tightly around herself as the storm roared around them. Together, the four figures stepped away from the stranded car and into the deep, swirling snow, disappearing slowly into the blizzard. The snow was far deeper than Sarah had expected. The moment they stepped away from the stranded car and onto the narrow roadside path, her boots sank almost halfway into the thick, powdery snow. Each step felt heavy and exhausting, as if she were trying to walk through soft sand that pulled her feet downward with every movement. The storm had grown even stronger. Cold wind rushed across the open road and through the dark forest nearby, pushing against them from all directions. Snowflakes swirled violently through the air, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Sarah pulled her coat tightly around her body as she struggled to keep moving. Her legs felt weak, and the freezing wind cut through every layer of clothing she wore. But she couldn't stop. Emma walked beside her, holding tightly onto her mother's hand. The little girl's fingers were stiff and cold, but she refused to let go. Her small boots slipped occasionally on the icy ground, forcing Sarah to steady her as they moved forward. Ahead of them, Jack pushed through the snow with determination. His large boots crushed through the deep drifts as he moved carefully, but confidently. In one hand, he held a powerful flashlight, its bright beam cutting through the darkness and swirling snow like a sharp blade of light. The beam moved slowly across the trees as Jack searched for something hidden in the storm. A narrow forest path. He had traveled this road before during another winter ride and remembered. A small hunter's cabin somewhere deep within the trees. It wasn't far from the highway, but in a storm like this, even a short distance could feel endless. Jack turned his head slightly and shouted over the roaring wind, "Stay right behind me." His voice was strong and clear, even against the violent storm. Noah clung tightly to the back of Jack's heavy biker jacket, holding the thick leather with both small hands. The oversized jacket Jack had wrapped around him earlier protected him from most of the freezing wind. Jack slowed his pace just enough to make sure the boy could keep up. Despite the dangerous conditions, Jack moved with steady confidence. Years of riding motorcycles through harsh weather and empty mountain roads had taught him how to navigate storms like this. He knew how to read the land. He knew where shelter could be found. The group continued pushing forward through the deep snow, step after exhausting step. Then suddenly, Jack stopped. Sarah nearly bumped into him as she struggled to catch her breath. Through the swirling snow ahead, a faint shape slowly appeared between the tall, dark trees. At first it looked like nothing more than a shadow. But as the flashlight beam moved across it, the shape became clearer. Wooden walls. A small roof covered in snow, and a narrow porch, barely visible through the storm. A small wooden cabin stood quietly in the forest. Shelter, warmth, safety, they had finally found it. Jack stepped onto the small wooden porch of the cabin, brushing a thick layer of snow from the old door with his gloved hand. The storm still raged behind them, the wind howling through the trees like a wild animal refusing to calm down. Without wasting a second, Jack grabbed the metal handle and pushed the cabin door open. The old hinges creaked loudly as the door slowly swung inward. A wave of cold air rushed into the dark interior, carrying snowflakes with it. For a brief moment, the cabin felt just as freezing as the storm outside. Jack quickly stepped inside first, shining his flashlight around the small room to make sure it was safe. The cabin was simple and old, clearly used by hunters or travelers during harsh winters. Wooden walls surrounded the room, and a thin layer of dust covered the rough furniture. A small table stood near one wall, and 2 old chairs were placed beside it. But most importantly, there was a fireplace. Jack moved toward it immediately. Sarah helped Emma and Noah step inside while pulling the door shut behind them, blocking most of the screaming wind outside. The sudden silence inside the cabin felt almost strange after the violent noise of the storm. But the cold still filled the room. The children's bodies continued shaking as they stood close together, their breath visible in the icy air. Jack knelt beside the old stone fireplace and quickly began searching the nearby woodpile. Luckily, the cabin's previous visitors had left behind several pieces of dry firewood stacked neatly beside the wall. "That's good," Jack muttered quietly. Within seconds, he began arranging the wood carefully inside the fireplace. Years of camping and long motorcycle trips had taught him how to start fires quickly, even in difficult conditions. He struck a lighter. A small flame appeared. For a moment, the tiny fire struggled against the cold air inside the cabin, but as the dry wood caught the flame, the fire slowly began to grow. Soon, the crackling sound of burning wood filled the room. Orange light danced across the wooden walls as warmth slowly spread through the cabin. The children reacted instantly. Emma and Noah rushed closer to the fireplace, stretching their small hands toward the rising warmth. Their frozen fingers slowly began to relax as the heat reached their skin. The violent shivering that had taken over their bodies started to fade. Color slowly returned to their pale faces. Sarah stood quietly a few steps away, watching the scene unfold. Her shoulders, which had been tense for what felt like hours, finally began to relax. The warm firelight reflected in her tired eyes. For the first time since their car had broken down on the frozen road, she felt something she had nearly lost during the storm. Relief. Deep, overwhelming relief. Outside, the blizzard still roared through the forest. But inside the small cabin, the fire burned brightly, and for the first time that night, they were safe. As the fire continued to crackle inside the small cabin, the warmth slowly began to spread through the room. The sharp, freezing air that had followed them inside started to fade, replaced by the comforting heat of the burning wood. Jack stood up from the fireplace and looked around the cabin carefully. The place was old, but sturdy. It had clearly been used by hunters and travelers during winter storms like this. He knew they would need more than just fire. The children needed something warm to drink. Jack walked toward the small kitchen area located in the corner of the cabin. It wasn't much, just a rough wooden counter, a small shelf, and a few old cooking tools left behind by previous visitors. He opened one of the cabinets. Inside, he found exactly what he hoped for. an old metal kettle. Next to it were a few emergency supplies stored neatly in small containers. Hunters often left simple supplies like these behind for emergencies. There were a few packets of dried soup mix, some tea bags, and a small container of salt. Jack nodded quietly to himself. "That'll do," he said under his breath. He filled the kettle with water from a large container placed beside the sink and carried it back toward the fireplace. Carefully, he placed the kettle close to the flames so the heat could warm the water. Within minutes, the kettle began to steam. Soon, the soft sound of boiling water filled the warm cabin. Jack prepared the soup quickly, stirring the mix into the hot water and pouring it into old metal cups he found in the cupboard. The simple smell of warm soup filled the room. Emma's tired face lit up immediately. For the first time since the terrifying night had begun, a small smile appeared on her face. She carefully held the warm cup between her hands, letting the heat travel through her fingers before taking a slow sip. Beside her, Noah had discovered a thick wool blanket Jack had pulled from an old storage chest near the wall. The boy wrapped it tightly around his shoulders, sinking deeper into its warmth as he sat near the fire. His shivering had finally stopped. Outside, the storm still roared through the dark forest, shaking the trees and covering the land with fresh snow. But inside the cabin, everything felt different now. The fire burned steadily. Warm light flickered across the wooden walls, and the small room felt safe. Sarah watched Jack quietly from across the room. Gratitude filled her eyes as she looked at the man who had appeared out of the storm and changed everything. "You saved us tonight," she said softly. Jack shrugged his shoulders as if the moment meant nothing. "Anyone would have done the same," he replied calmly. But both of them knew the truth. Out there in the freezing storm, not everyone would have stopped. Hours slowly passed as the storm continued raging outside the small wooden cabin. The powerful wind howled through the dark forest, shaking the tall trees and sending waves of snow crashing against the cabin walls. Occasionally, the roof creaked under the weight of the falling snow, reminding everyone that the blizzard was far from over. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was completely different. The warm fire in the stone fireplace burned steadily, soft orange light dancing across the wooden walls and filling the room with comforting warmth. The crackling sound of burning wood created a calm rhythm that slowly pushed away the fear and tension of the terrifying night. Emma and Noah sat close to the fireplace, wrapped in thick blankets Jack had found in the old storage chest. Their small hands stretched toward the warmth of the flames, soaking in the heat after hours of freezing in the broken car. The hot soup Jack had prepared earlier had helped restore their strength. Slowly, the exhaustion from the long and frightening night began to take over. Emma leaned gently against her brother as her eyes began to close. Noah, still wrapped tightly in Jack's oversized biker jacket and the wool blanket, rested his head against the wooden floor near the fire. Within minutes, both children had fallen asleep. Their breathing became slow and peaceful, finally free from the shivering that had taken over their bodies earlier that night. Sarah watched them quietly, her heart filled with relief as she carefully stood up and walked over to them. She gently pulled the blankets higher around their shoulders, making sure they were fully covered and warm. For a moment she simply stood there, watching her children sleep. The soft firelight reflected in her tired eyes. Just a few hours earlier, she had truly believed they might not survive the storm. But now they were safe. Across the room, Jack sat quietly in an old wooden chair near the cabin door. His large figure looked almost like a shadow in the dim light. He leaned back slightly, resting his arms on the chair as he kept watch over the small cabin. Every now and then, the wind outside would shake the door, and Jack's eyes would lift toward it instinctively. He was used to nights like this. His gaze eventually returned to the fireplace. He stared into the dancing flames thoughtfully, his face calm but distant. Sometimes the world judged people by how they looked. a rough biker. A leather jacket, a long beard. Too many people, that image meant trouble. But the truth was something different. Because sometimes, heroes didn't look like heroes. Sometimes they looked like rough bikers riding through deadly snowstorms, appearing exactly when someone needed them the most. Morning finally arrived. After hours of darkness and the terrifying roar of the storm, the first rays of sunlight slowly broke through the heavy gray clouds hanging above the forest. The violent blizzard that had shaken the night had finally passed, leaving behind a quiet and peaceful winter landscape. Outside the cabin, the world looked completely transformed. Fresh snow covered everything: the trees, the ground, and the small wooden porch of the cabin. The snow sparkled under the soft, golden sunlight like thousands of tiny diamonds scattered across the forest. For the first time in many hours, the air felt calm. No roaring wind, no violent snow, just silence. Inside the cabin, Sarah slowly opened the wooden door and stepped outside. The cold morning air brushed gently against her face, but it no longer felt dangerous or threatening like it had during the storm. She stood on the porch and looked around the quiet forest. The nightmare of the night before suddenly felt distant. Just hours earlier, she and her children had been trapped inside a frozen car on the side of an empty highway, unsure if anyone would ever find them. Now, they were standing safely outside a warm cabin, alive. Behind her, she heard the joyful sound of children laughing. Emma and Noah had just woken up and were peeking through the cabin doorway. Their faces were bright again, full of life and energy. The warmth of the fire and a good night's rest had completely changed them. The fear and cold from the night had finally disappeared. Emma stepped outside carefully, leaving small footprints in the fresh snow. "Mom, look," she said excitedly, pointing toward the snow-covered trees glowing under the sunlight. Sarah smiled softly. Then she heard another familiar sound nearby, the deep rumble of a motorcycle engine. Jack stood beside his large bike near the edge of the cabin clearing. He had already brushed the snow from the seat and started the engine, preparing to leave. The motorcycle growled quietly in the calm morning air. Sarah walked a few steps toward him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no long speeches. Jack simply gave her a small nod. "Take care of those kids," he said calmly. Sarah nodded back, her voice filled with gratitude she could barely express. "Thank you for everything." Jack didn't respond with words. Instead, he pulled on his gloves, turned the motorcycle toward the snowy forest road, and slowly began to ride away. The powerful bike disappeared between the tall white trees, leaving only faint tire tracks in the snow behind. Sarah stood quietly, watching until he was completely gone. It was strange how someone who looked so rough and intimidating could turn out to be exactly the help they needed. A biker who looked dangerous had become the guardian angel who saved their lives that night.